Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Christ is born.
Amen.
God bless you. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas, Father.
Thank you for coming out in the cold weather. My homily for you today is a brief explanation of the hymn that we've been singing throughout the service, the Troparion, or the hymn of the Nativity. Your nativity, O Christ our God, has shown to the world the light of wisdom. For by it those who worship the stars were taught by a star to adore you, the Son of Righteousness, and to know you, the Orient from on high. O Lord, glory to you. Now this homily is a review of my class that I gave about 2 weeks ago on Wednesday night. So if you heard that class, you will not be surprised by anything you hear today. But for those who did, it's a nice little song. So first of all, the Nativity of Christ has shown to the world the light of wisdom. What is that about? What is happening there? If we look into the 2nd century, at the very first decade of the 2nd century, we find the person of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who we just celebrated 5 days ago, was his feast day. One of the disciples of the disciples, one of the apostolic fathers. And he writes in his epistle to the Ephesians about the Nativity of Christ, one of the earliest witnesses that we have to the early Christian understanding of what was taking place in the Nativity. He writes this, he says, "Hidden from the prince of this world were the virginity of Mary, her childbearing, and likewise also the death of the Lord. 3 mysteries to be cried aloud, 3 mysteries which were wrought in the silence of God." St. Ignatius is pointing to us this theme of the mystery of the Messiah, the mystery of his birth, of his coming into the world, the mystery even of his death and resurrection, which would later, of course, come to be cried aloud. They were hidden at first from the prince of this world. What is that talking about? Who is the prince of this world? It's not my friend Prince who died in Minneapolis several years ago. It's the devil himself. It's Satan. St. Paul speaks of the gospel as a mystery as well, and it has to do with hiding it from the demonic powers. He writes in 1 Corinthians 2, "But we speak of the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." You see, that was the devil's big mistake. He thought he was accomplishing something when he crucified the Lord of glory. He thought that he was inspiring wisdom in Herod when Herod sought to slay the innocents in Bethlehem. But had he known who it was that was born in a manger and lay in a stable for us, he would not have dared to touch that figure. Because through the death of Christ, life sprang forth from the tomb, and his power was destroyed. Therefore, St. Paul also says in Ephesians chapter 3, what is the purpose now then of the mystery being revealed after the death and resurrection of Christ? He says that he was called to preach among the nations the unsearchable riches of Christ, to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. The task of the church now is to proclaim the death and resurrection and birth of Christ and the coming of the Messiah to the world, and not just to the world, but to the princes of the heavenly powers, the fallen angels that rule over this world or attempt to. And so it was that the story of the Nativity actually has a great deal to do with this theme. And it all kind of connects in with the story of the Magi. Who are the Magi? The term comes from Persia, ancient Persia. The Majus, or the Magi, were the early Zoroastrian priests, but also they were astrologers and masters of esoteric knowledge, right? That's from which we get now the terms magician, practicers of magic. And these wise men who were learned in all of these arts, arts which the ancient world universally understood as being inspired and derived from those heavenly powers, which they didn't think of as bad guys. They thought of them as their gods and angelic powers there to help them, and spirits of inspiration, right? They were students of that world, of a fallen, demonic world. St. Ignatius continues. He says, "How then were these mysteries made manifest to the ages? A star shone forth in the heaven above all the stars, and its light was unutterable, and its strangeness caused amazement. And all the rest of the constellations, with the sun and the moon, formed themselves into a chorus about the star. But the star itself far outshone them all. And there was perplexity to know whence came this strange appearance, which was so unlike them." The Magi would have been very curious about this star, being the astrologers of the ancient age. They understood from their worldview that things happening in the heavens also indicated things happening on earth, that there was a connection between the two, that there was an influence. And even the Jews understood this as well. The ancient Jews understood their connection between the earth and the stars. In the ancient worldview, stars were not inanimate balls of gas. They were not just these distant objects floating in millions and millions of light years away, right? They were actually the outward and visible forms of angels, of angelic beings, principalities and powers in the heavenly places, what the pagans called gods, but were not God by nature. And so when we read in Luke chapter 2, "Suddenly there was with the angel speaking to the shepherds a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, 'Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill among men.'" The people who heard this in the first century, who first heard the gospel, were not necessarily thinking simply of angels proclaiming this, flying around in the sky, but they saw the entire heavens, the stars, the moon, the sun, the planets. All of them were participating in this chorus because they were all of the same type of being. And so St. Ignatius can say, the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations form themselves into a chorus because that's what it means for the heavenly host to be singing and crying aloud. Now this has deeper significance, as you might guess, than simply, wow, that's neat, the stars are singing. The image of the stars adoring and worshiping Christ was a profound reversal of the state of affairs in the mindset of the ancient pagans. The ancient pagans understood themselves as bowing down and worshiping the hosts of heaven, of worshiping the stars and seeing their gods in the sky. The reason why our planets are still to this day named what? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Gaia or Earth, Jupiter, Saturn. These are all the names of gods because they believed these, what they saw in the sky, were visible manifestations of the gods. And this was part of the problem of mankind throughout the entire Old Testament period, was that the Jewish people were drawn to worship the one true God who was the creator of heaven and earth, of the stars and the moons and the constellations, and not to worship the stars themselves. But they kept being drawn away because the nations around them did this. And they were seduced by it and enticed by that. And they were unfaithful to the God of Israel. And they followed. And so Deuteronomy chapter 4 warned them, "Take heed lest you lift your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the host of heaven, that you feel driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord your God has given to all the nations under the whole heaven as a heritage." See, originally the nations were assigned to these angels. And the angels were supposed to watch over them. But then when they turned around and started worshiping the angels, that was a distortion. That was a disorder and a calamity. that caused great hardship. But now we are seeing that the stars are worshiping the star leading to the one true God, the star of the Son of God, the star of the Nativity. It's a sign of things to come. It's a sign of the reversal of the order of the fallen world. And so St. Ignatius can boldly say, and remember, he lives in a day, in an age where he will be martyred for his faith by a culture which is profoundly pagan and deeply understands these things and views these things as normal. And he has the temerity to say this: from that time forward, every sorcery and every spell was dissolved. The ignorance of wickedness vanished away. The ancient kingdom was pulled down, the kingdom of all these gods. When God appeared in the likeness of man unto the newness of everlasting life, and that which had been perfected in the counsels of God began to take effect. They just were beginning at this time. And thence all things were perturbed. All things were troubled, like Herod was troubled. The stars, the sun, and the moon, all the hosts of heaven were troubled because the abolishing of death was taken in hand. The birth of Christ is the beginning of the end of death. And it's the beginning of the end of the dominion of death and the dominion of the devil and all the fallen angels. So how is it that God would use such an overtly seeming pagan way of revealing his Son to the world? St. John Chrysostom writes about this, where he makes the case that the star of the Nativity, this unusually bright and star that did not behave as expected by moving here and there and then stopping over one place, he said it was not truly an angel or a star as we understand it, but was an angel, was an angelic being coming to bear witness. And so he says, wherefore, one may say, why did he attract the wise men by such a vision? Why? How should he have done it, do you think? Should he have sent prophets? The Magi would not have submitted themselves to prophets. Should he have uttered a voice from above? They would not have listened. Should he have sent an angel? But even him they would have hurried by. And so for this cause, dismissing all those means, God calls them by the things that were familiar to them in exceeding condescension. And he shows a large and extraordinary star, so as to astonish them, both at the greatness and beauty of its appearance and the manner of its course. So God uses the things of the pagan world to draw the pagans to the awareness of himself. He uses a star to draw those who worship the stars. He uses astrologers to discover the creator of the stars. Now, does this mean that God was somehow affirming the worldview of astrology? Should we all now check our horoscopes and so forth? No. Rather understand that God was shrewdly appealing to, but at the same time altering, the wise men's worldview and understanding, bringing them to a greater wisdom through the things that they already understood. And brothers and sisters, I think you will find that God does this through us as well. If God came to you and said, forget everything you know, it's totally different, you're wrong about everything, here's how it is, most of us would say, don't tell me. I don't want to hear that. But rather, God knows how stubborn we are. He knows how stiff-necked we are and how close-minded we are, frankly. And so he works through us through the things with which we are already familiar. And he speaks to us through things that later we will look back and say, yeah, I didn't need any of that. But thank God that he did work through it to bring me eventually to the knowledge of the truth. And in fact, he had done this and had been doing this all along, even through the Old Testament, even from the beginning of Genesis. If you look at the origin story, the creation story in the first chapters of Genesis, they are profoundly similar to the stories of the pagan myths in the ancient world, but only so much. They also alter the narrative. They also change things. Whereas the ancient world would have seen things being generated out of chaos and taking form, they did not understand them in the same way. They did not understand that there was a good and loving God who was creating them. Some treat it, as modern materialist atheists look at it, as just a random occurrence by accident. Others saw it as a result of conflict and war. That is, the fight of the gods and the giants, and left was mankind on the battlefield to pick up the pieces. But Genesis says all of those things, there was formlessness and void, but God spoke and made it so. And God saw it and said, this is good. And so he upturned the whole notion of creation in the story of Genesis. He does the same thing now with the worship of the stars by the Magi. So St. John Chrysostom continues, think it not therefore unworthy of him to have called them by a star, since by the same rule you will find fault with all the Jewish rites, the sacrifices, the purifications also, the new moons, even the ark and the temple to itself. For even these derive their origin from Gentile grossness, he says. Because the ancient pagan cultures had temples. They even had arks. They had rituals and sacrifices and new moons. But God transformed all of those in the covenant with Moses and gave the people of Israel a way of understanding them in a new way. A way of worshiping not idols, but the one true God. That's why the temple was empty. It had the ark, it had the throne of God, but no idol or statue sitting atop of it. And that way, through the mystery of his revelation to them, they would understand God is not contained in statues and idols. And yet for all that, God, for the salvation of them that were in error, St. John says, endured to be served by these things. He willed to be served by such things, whereby those without were used to serve devils. But he only slightly altered them, that he might draw them off by degrees from their customs and lead them towards the highest wisdom. So God, even though the Magi were in their own mind at that time, still acting as if they were worshiping the stars, by following the star, God changed their understanding along that journey and brought them to the knowledge of the truth, to higher wisdom. Just so he did in the case of the wise men also, St. John says, not disdaining them, to call them by the sight of a star, that he might lift them higher ever after. Therefore, after he has brought them, leading them by the hand, and has set them by the manger, it is no longer by a star, but by an angel that he now discourses unto them. So when they find the Christ child, no longer are they following stars, but rather they heed the voice of the angel that says, go, don't return to Herod. And thus, he says, little by little they became better men. Brothers and sisters, look at your own life and see how Christ has brought you to the knowledge of wisdom and revealed himself to you through things that you would no longer necessarily cling to or that you would follow. Realize how good God has been and merciful and condescending to your understanding, and how he continually do so throughout our entire life, taking things that once served evil and being turned to his purposes, so that we would turn away from them and worship the true God. Christmas is a whole lot more than just, fun and presents and family and all those good things. It's also a bombshell of a revelation to the world. It's a radical change and a shift of our understanding of what creation is, what the heavens is, the earth is, what our place is. It's meant to wake us up to that higher wisdom. Father Stephen DeYoung, whose book we've been studying in our Wednesday night classes, speaks about Christmas in very startling terms, and I'll use his words to close the homily. He says this: Christmas is the beginning of an insurgency. Yahweh, the God of Israel, has come in person to the heart of a hostile world ruled over by hostile powers. This birth is discovered by the enemies of God only after the fact, through the star, and when discovered, leads to an immediate attempt to slay him before the unknown plan can go forward. In 12 days, an open declaration of war will be made when the new Joshua, that's Jesus, his name is Joshua in Hebrew, crosses the Jordan once again to enter the land at Theophany, and Christ reveals himself publicly to both hostiles and their hostages. That's why Christmas and Theophany are combined together. They're part of the same story, right? The final battle will come when Christ himself invades the palace of the devil's king, Hades itself, before rising from the dead and destroying the power of death in order to reclaim the nations, to reclaim all mankind. And so St. Ignatius reminds us that the Nativity is the first shot fired. Yahweh has come to visit his people, and though he is an infant in a feeding trough in a cave, he has still come as a conquering king. He has not only entered in his creation in some sort of abstract and philosophical sense to bring us enlightenment. He has invaded it to take vengeance upon his enemies, the enemies of mankind. He is born to destroy those who have taken us captive and to set us free. He is born to crush the ones who wield the power of death and grant us unending life. So brothers and sisters, may God bless you. May Christ crush your enemies this Christmas and bring you everlasting life. Christ is among us. He is born.